Welcome, everybody, to Left Reckoning. We're launching our new series, Our Radical Tradition. And it's an incredible opportunity right now to be joined by Paul O'Connell, professor of law at SOAS University, editor at Legal Forum. And he's also launched a new project called the Political Education Project, where he is a member of the steering group. Paul O'Connell is somebody whose work you should definitely check out. We'll have links to his work, his Twitter, and all the ways that you can follow him. Thanks so much for joining us today, Paul.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on, and great to see you guys going from strength to strength with this new project.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and it's we're really happy for you to make your Left Reckoning debut with us, and on a subject that I know you're probably as thrilled as we are to talk about, which is James Connolly, who's one of the great socialist theorists globally, but also in that great Irish tradition as well. So, I mean, I think we should just try to dive into it. Could you give us a brief biography as to who James Connolly was and what social movements he was a part of?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much. And I should say, because I've got Scottish comrades who like to joke about this, but the greatest Irish Marxist of all time was a Scotsman, obviously, albeit the child of two Irish immigrants from Monaghan. So Connolly was born in Edinburgh in 1868 into Cowgate, which is a slum part, like a proper hovel at the time, mainly made up of Irish immigrants. He left school at the age of 11 and then worked in various jobs as a labourer. So, from the age of 11, he worked at various things. He then, interestingly, given the sort of role he came to play in the sort of pantheon of Irish nationalist heroes, at the age of 14, he lied about his age to join the British Army. And it's almost certain, although the record isn't entirely clear, it's almost certain that the first time he set foot in Ireland was in the uniform of the Royal Scots Guard. And so he served a bit of time in Ireland for the British Army. He was due to be shipped off to India then with his unit, but he deserted and he went to live with his brother in Dundee in Scotland. And at that time, Dundee was a heavily industrialised area and had a very active socialist movement. And Connolly, at this stage in his early 20s, got involved with that. And from that point on, was a committed Marxist. And for the rest of his life, was a committed Marxist and active socialist. In 1896, he came to Dublin. And he moved to Dublin to become the organizer of a small group called the Dublin Socialist Club. And the first thing he did was pretty much dissolve and reorganize it as the Irish Socialist Republican Party, which then was a small group, membership never exceeding a couple of 100, but played an important part in Ireland in the late 19th and into the early 20th century in terms of being involved in anti-imperialist activities. When the Queen came to visit Dublin, Connolly and other left-wing activists organised a march through Dublin with a coffin with the British Empire written on the side of it. And when the police intervened to stop them, Connolly threw the coffin into the river and said, "There she goes, the British Empire setting off into the sun." So he was active. They didn't, they didn't form a mass organization, but he played an important role. In 1903, then he moved to the US. He emigrated over to the US mainly for work in the first instance. But when he was there, he then immediately got involved in socialist and left-wing politics in the US. He joined Daniel de Leon's SLP and was in that organization for a number of years. He clashed with de Leon a lot. I don't know, I'm sure you guys know this, and I'm sure many of your readers know it, but de Leon was a very sort of mechanical Marxist, the type of person who subscribed to the idea that technology was going to do the work, and eventually through automation and through the development of new forms of technology, we would sort of burst through the fetters of capitalist relations of production. Connolly was much more focused, and we can come back to this later on because this is one of the central themes in his work, was much more focused on the need for working class activity and working class self-emancipation. So him and de Leon clashed an awful lot over that. Connolly then found a natural enough home in the Wobblies. He joined in 1905 and became an active member in the Wobblies. He was involved in doing all sorts of propaganda work, organising strikes and solidarity actions. He also did really important work at that time around trying to break down the divisions between different nationalities of migrants who'd moved to the US, because, of course, the US ruling class used racism both between the Anglo settlers of the US and then the newly arrived migrants. So Connolly spent an awful lot of time trying to break down those divisions between religions and between nationalities. He wrote one of his most important pamphlets at that time called Labour, Nationality and Religion, where he tried to sort of address these issues. He also wrote, which is one of the readings I think you might have shared with your patrons, he also wrote what's become known as Socialism Made Easy, or the workshop talks, which he delivered as a set of talks for workers. And again, this is really important for understanding Connolly and understanding his Marxism. I'm sure, again, you guys will know this, but Marx's Capital has its origins in a set of talks he gave to workers' organizations in Belgium when he was living there briefly, which were produced as a pamphlet. Value, price, and profit, I think it was, and that then led on to that laid the foundations and led on to Marx's much more substantive political economy, and that direct connection with us and that connection of ideas to the day-to-day struggles of the working class was crucial for Connolly. So one of the reasons for me personally why Connolly is so important is that even though he left school at the age of 11, because of his class background, because of his experiences, and because of his dedication and effort, he understood Marxism far better than very many people with multiple PhDs and master's degrees and so forth, because he grasped the sort of revolutionary essence of it and what it meant. So the workshop talks were published in Chicago in 1908. In 1910, Connolly moved back to Ireland. He actually said at one point that leaving Ireland was the worst decision he ever made. So he moved back to Ireland in 1910 and promptly got involved with the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which was a new radical union in the sort of wobbly IWW tradition, the sort of one big union approach. Connolly was first involved in Belfast, where he played an important role in trying to break down sectarian divisions in Belfast. Of course, if you know Irish history, and you know, I'm sure people do know this, but the sort of sectarian divisions fostered by British colonisation and the plantation of Ulster in particular that divided Protestant against Catholic and so forth. So Connolly managed to form a trade union flute band, which had people from both communities. Again, some of your viewers might have known or might have seen in the past marching season and so forth in Ireland when the loyalists try to march into nationalist areas, and there's always serious violent struggles, and that unfortunately is still an ongoing problem. But Connolly was chipping away at those divisions by getting people from both sides to form a Labour flute band rather than a nationalist or a loyalist flute band. He also helped in particular with women workers who worked in the garment industry in Belfast when their own trade union wouldn't come out and support them. Connolly went in and was a sort of staunch ally for them, helped them think through strategic reasons around organising. He then left to go to Dublin in 1913. And this was a pivotal turning point because, again, I'm sure many people know about this, what became known as the 1913 lockout in Dublin was unfolding. And so basically, tram workers in Dublin had gone on strike. And the Irish capitalist class, led by an individual called William Martin Murphy, who owned the main newspapers in Ireland, but owned many other things, saw this and understood the nature of this in terms of a generic or a general class struggle. And so they locked out the workers, not just from the trams, but from various other jobs, anybody who showed solidarity with the striking tram workers. And Connolly, again, he grasped this. He wrote about it at the time, and he ended up serving a small period in prison during it and so forth. But he understood that this was a titanic struggle between labour and capital, and it was one that had relevance not just for the Irish working class, but for the working class across Europe. The lockout raged for a number of months. The police used exceptional violence against workers who were protesting and striking. This led Connolly and others to form the Irish Citizen Army, which was the first sort of workers' militia in Western Europe in the 20th century. Connolly insisted at the time that men and women should be equal members in the Irish Citizen Army, which was quite progressive for that time. Jim Larkin, who was another famous Irish Labour leader, he wanted separate groups for men and women. Presumably the women would stay at home and make the sandwiches. But Connolly was of the view that no, men and women are in this struggle in equal parts and they should both play a part. The lockout had great solidarity from workers around Europe and particularly in Britain. Mining communities in Wales took the children of Irish strikers over there so they could look after them, feed them, clothe them and so forth while the parents were on strike. Wow. The Catholic Church told the parents that sent their kids over that they'd be excommunicated from the church for sending their kids over to godless England or godless Wales, as the case was then. The workers in Britain supported it, but the trade union establishment didn't. So the TUC, Connolly and Larkin travelled over there and asked the TUC to call for a lockout in Britain of Irish imports. So basically they were saying, well, the bosses are trying to isolate us. We need you to step in and isolate them. The TUC didn't follow through and the strike was ultimately defeated. What comes after that then, of course, is the moving towards the outbreak of war in Europe. Connolly was part of the Second International, but he was very much to the left of the Second International. And when the major social democratic parties in Europe, the SPD and others, when they betrayed their internationalist sort of putative internationalist commitments and backed their own ruling classes in the war, Connolly, along with Lenin and Luxembourg and a handful of others, was vocally against it. I think it's fair to say that the outbreak of the war and the betrayal of the Second International, the collapse of the Second International, demoralized Connolly. I think he sort of was very much in that tradition, albeit to the left of it, and to see it suddenly dissipate. And he wrote some really sort of moving lines around it about how those people who'd been declaring their fraternity and so forth would now be firing, shells into the ranks of their brothers on the other side and so forth. So he was really disappointed by it. As the war raged and as it unfolded, Connolly was part of the anti-war movement in Ireland. Also, was a vocal defender of civil liberties, again, arguing against conscription and various other things. But he also reached the conclusion that it would be necessary in Ireland to attempt to mount an insurrection against the British government while the war was going on. This is important for how Connolly is viewed in Irish history. The Irish ruling class, Connolly was executed in 1960, and come on to that in a second. But the first biography that was written of Connolly after he was executed was written by a Jesuit priest, and it very quickly stripped Connolly of his Marxism and his socialism and focused on Connolly, the patriot and the good man, who possibly, even though he'd been an atheist most of his life, who possibly took last rites on his deathbed. And so he wanted to focus on this Connolly and sanitize Connolly, which is interesting because Connolly, many years before, writing about Wolfe Tone, who was a leader of the Irish Rebellion in 1798, Connolly said that apostles of freedom are always celebrated when dead but crucified when alive. So it was interesting to see that he became a victim to this himself. In Dublin then, and in Ireland, there's a train station named after him, there's a hospital named after him. The Irish Labour Party, which is like a hideous sort of dollar store version of the Democrats over there, they fly his banner every year, even though they have absolutely no claim to it in any meaningful sense. So they tried to domesticate Connolly, but this is important, that Connolly was not a nationalist. Connolly was an internationalist at every step of the way, and his engagement in the 1916 Rising was viewed from an internationalist perspective. His view was, if a successful blow could be struck against the British Empire in Ireland, that would precipitate a set of uprisings around Europe, which could ultimately bring the war to an end and could lead to a revolutionary development for the working class in Europe. And then famously, when many sort of pseudo-radicals have criticized Connolly for being led astray by nationalism, whatever the case might be, Lenin famously said that Connolly was absolutely right in what he did. And the only problem is that he did it too soon. That they misjudged the situation by a year.
Yeah, I have this Lenin quote because I wanted to share it because it is a very interesting quote here, because even Trotsky and other members, surrounding Lenin were very, very down on the Easter uprising. And Lenin criticized the people who were against the Easter uprising as being monstrously doctrinaire and pedantic. He said the uprising expressed itself in the street fighting conducted by a section of the urban petty bourgeoisie and a section of the workers after a long period of mass agitation, demonstration, suppression of the press, etc. Whoever calls such an uprising a putsch is either a hardened reactionary or a doctrinaire hopelessly incapable of picturing a social revolution as a living thing.
Yeah, there's a further line in that quote where he says something to the effect of, whoever wants to see a perfect revolution will never see one, and such people only pay lip service to revolution and don't actually want the real thing. And this is the thing with Connolly in that context. I mean, it's interesting. So right throughout Connolly's time in Ireland, he understood, and I think this is an important discussion, and there are slight variations on this in different countries around the world and so forth, but it's important that, and I believe this, and I read this in Connolly, it's important to vernacularize the socialist tradition. Right? It's not sufficient to walk into, if you walked into your local bar in Texas, or if you were up in New York, it's not sufficient to walk in there and start telling people what Marx said and what Trotsky said and what Lenin said, and that's all fine. Unless you can connect it up to a radical tradition that speaks to them in some way, it'll mean nothing. And actually, if you look in your sort of hemisphere, broadly speaking, this is what the Cubans did. They mobilized the language of Jose Marti and a progressive sort of nationalism to also then try and push through a more progressive and sort of socialist and communist agenda. Likewise, in Venezuela in recent years, Chavez understood the importance of the figure of Bolivar, and even though they were trying to build socialism for the 21st century, they used that imagery and that language. In Bolivia as well, they used the sort of indigenous tradition and the idea of plurinationalism in order to mobilize the masses there. So it's crucially important, and Connolly understood this. Now, Connolly ridiculed the romantic middle class nationalists. So Paul Rick Pierce, who was also one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, he was part of that late 19th, early 20th century romantic tradition where he talked about blood sacrifice and the cold heart of the earth needs to be warmed by the blood of young men and all this sort of drivel. And Connolly just slaughtered them. He said, these are people who've never swung a punch in anger. They know nothing about violence. They're talking absolute foolishness. But he also then sort of made the important connection between political freedom in Ireland and social freedom. He said, these are two sides of the one coin. And what he tried to do was he tried to push the most radical elements, and many of them were working class, most radical elements of the Republican movement towards socialism. So we've got this great pamphlet, a great little essay called Let's Free Ireland, where he basically just lampoons the nationalists. And he says, hooray for liberty, let's free Ireland. The next time you get evicted, the person that does it will be wearing a green uniform and not a red one of the British Crown. Hooray for liberty. When you're being walked into the poorhouse, they'll play St. Patrick's Day rather than God Save the Queen. So he basically just sort of lambasted this and said, if you're serious about freedom, then it has to be the whole hog. You have to be about national freedom and social freedom. So, as I said, following the outbreak of World War I, Connolly then became increasingly convinced that there was a need for an insurrection. And it's interesting, again, in terms of how history has been rewritten in Ireland. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the clandestine organisation of the most militant nationalists, they had notions of organising an insurrection. There's an old Irish Republican slogan that Britain's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. This is an old sort of slogan. So they were thinking about doing something, but they were doing it clandestine and in secret. Connolly was out in public saying it. Connolly was out in public saying, we need to do this, we need to get on the streets. They'd formed the Irish Citizen Army, they were armed, we need to act. And so the IRB abducted him and had a conversation with him and basically sort of swore him into their organisation and then agreed with Connolly that they'd lead the Rising. Now, the Rising in 1916, when it happened, it was militarily a failure. It was symbolically important, but the proclamation that was issued on it was very advanced. It talked about the equal rights of all, cherishing the children of the nation equally, and the language in that was clearly influenced by Connolly. If Connolly hadn't been part of that milieu, it would have been a much more limited, much more restrictive piece. Connolly then was injured because, again, during the fighting, and also because he had military service, and just because I suspect of his personality in general, he didn't sit back and sort of give orders during the Rising. He was on the front lines, and he was shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the hip. And the one in the hip fractured his hip and his leg. So when the Rising was defeated, Connolly was stretchered out, and then when all the leaders were executed, and it should be said that the Irish capitalist class were pushing very hard for Connolly to be executed once the opportunity arose. Because he couldn't stand, he was strapped into a chair and he was shot by a firing squad. Interestingly, in Parliament at the time, when the British Labour Party MPs heard about this, they cheered because for them, someone like Connolly was a thorn in the side rather than a sort of comrade in another country. So Connolly, as I said, he had an important impact. He played a role as an active socialist and a Marxist in Scotland, in Ireland, in the US. He wrote tons that are still relevant on working class organisation, on parliamentarianism, on nationalism and internationalism. We'll come on to all that in a minute. After he died in Ireland, unfortunately, before Ireland was partitioned, when it was first being mooted, Connolly said that if this happens, it will lead to a carnival of reaction, that it will allow for the formation of a reactionary Protestant state in the north and a reactionary Catholic state in the south. And this is exactly what happened. And we're still unpacking and unpicking the legacy of that in Ireland. And also, when Connolly died, he hadn't really formed a disciplined, coherent socialist organisation around himself. So the Irish Labour movement, the Irish socialist movement and so forth has never really recovered from that blow. And Irish politics has been dominated since the 1920s onwards by the national question. Now, things are changing a bit in the last 15, 20 years with various sort of social changes around same-sex marriage, around women's right to choose in terms of reproductive rights. There's been massive sort of social changes within the Irish population and so forth. And Connolly's been rediscovered by a new generation, and he definitely offers sort of insights both for them, but also internationally. So I'll leave it there. I could literally speak for hours about it, Paul.
Oh, no. I mean, this is such a great introduction. And, Connolly is someone who's, is growing more and more interesting to me because he's something that's rarer and rarer on today's left as someone who is a great theorist and a great writer, but who also was doing the work too, in the tradition of like Lenin. And I think when you read Connolly's work too, and I think we should maybe start here when we're jumping into his theory, I can't help but see similarities between Connolly and the questions that he's trying to deal with and the questions that Frantz Fanon had to deal with, right? We're just how do you deal with this, essentially colonial state and then also build something that is going to turn into more of a socialist revolution versus a kind of, what Fanon called like, the national bourgeoisie. And that ended up being Connolly's struggle in his political life.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I think this is where Connolly was so acute in understanding that. And again, it's where nationalism, there's an important debate to be had about the question of nationalism. There's too often a simplistic dismissal of it. And I understand where that comes from, but it really depends on context. In Vietnam, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Algeria and elsewhere, nationalism plays a very different role to what it plays in imperial metropoles, whether that be Germany, whether it be Britain, whether it be the US. It's a very different creature. Fanon understood this, and Fanon also understood the emergence of a sort of comprador national bourgeoisie who would, again, this was Connolly's thing about Let's Free Ireland and that lampooning, that basically, yeah, they'll happily sort of change over the reins of power, but they won't change the substance of it. And so that was Connolly's point. So at this point in time, Connolly has said is part of the Second International, which in its dominant trend had a very sort of mechanical understanding of social change. And the idea was that you have to go through the stages of historical development. And so this is why many in the Second International criticized his involvement in the rise. And the idea was, well, no, you should have been forming a coalition with the national bourgeoisie in order to establish a bourgeois democratic republic and wait for the development of a much more radical working class in Britain, wait your turn and so forth. Whereas Connolly was like, well, no, we intervene. Now, again, this isn't just voluntarism on Connolly's part. It's informed by his deep reading and understanding of Marx, of the Marxist tradition. And if you go and read Marx himself, again, Marx understood the importance of these interventions. Marx understood specifically around the Irish question the importance that a struggle and a victory within Ireland could have for the British and the international working class. If the Irish were able to throw off and break British imperialism, what this would then mean for the British and the working class. So yeah, Connolly was acutely aware of that. And this again is part of the reason why the Irish bourgeoisie, the middle class nationalists, heavily influenced by the Catholic Church, it's why they completely domesticated them as quickly as they could and sort of brushed out of history all as, it was only really in the 60s and 70s that his work was discovered, or sort of repopularized in Ireland and elsewhere, because it was this sort of unequivocal, unambiguous Marxist position. He wasn't just a socialist. He wasn't a sort of leftist, to use that vague and loose term. He was a Marxist, root and branch. That was his politics, and it informed everything he did. And because of that, that informed how he viewed nationalism. That informed how he viewed the relationship between struggle for national independence and socialist revolution. And it was that acute awareness of that, which again, I think there are parallels with Fanon and others around that as well, and Amy Cesar and others as well, in different contexts. Yeah.
Before we get back to nationalism, I'm curious. I was interested in what you said about that split about the role of women in the struggle, because there's this, and we'll get into Socialism Made Easy more in depth. But there's this part that I was surprised to see. I guess maybe I shouldn't have been, but let's see if I can find it. And when we find that in our organizations, we will have women's suffrage, whether governments like it or not. We will also have in our organizations a pure and uncorrupted ballot. Talk a little bit more about the feminism before we get back to the nationalism side of this.
Yeah, definitely. So again, not just feminism, but I think liberation politics more broadly, but feminism more particularly at that time. Connolly was really important. And again, the leading women activists and feminists of that period, of the Irish Revolutionary period, every single one of them, to a woman, was the staunchest male ally they had within the movement was Connolly. And so on the Irish Citizen Army, that was one aspect of it. But also in his last major work, which was called The Reconquest of Ireland, in which he sort of articulated a vision for transforming Irish society, there's a section in there on women. And there's actually, I'll read a passage from it because it's really good. But the point with this is Connolly identifies first what we'd call these days, or what some people would call these days, intersectionality, where he says that workers within capitalist society are slaves, and women within capitalist society are the slaves of slaves. That it's compounded for women, that women are working class, but they're also, because of their gender and their sort of position within society, they're doubly exploited because of that. And he makes a really important point in this where he says, and I'll read a passage from it. He says, "There's none so fit to break the chains as those who bear them," right? And this is really important for when we talk about socialism and liberation politics. Connolly says, and he's talking about women here specifically, but you could extrapolate from that, talk about black people, talking about trans people, whatever the case may be. It's those who experience the oppression who get to make the decisions and who get to say the direction of movement of the broader struggle around this. And the working class movement should support this. But there's an important point, and I'll read it if that's okay, because I didn't want to I don't want to sort of mischaracterize it. So Connolly's talking about women in particular here, and he says, there's none so fit to break the chains as those who wear them, none so well equipped to decide what is a fetter. In its march towards freedom, the working class of Ireland must cheer on the efforts of those women who, feeling in their souls and bodies the fetters of the ages, have arisen to strike them off, and cheer all the louder if it is in hatred of thraldom and passion for freedom that the women's army forges ahead of the militant army of labour. So he was saying, right, on certain things, the women's movement, black power struggles, they might be ahead of us as the broader labour movement because they've experienced that oppression. They know what they're fighting against. They take the lead on this. But then, so he says, and we have to cheer them along and support them every step of the way. But then he makes this important point, which is the last sentence on this. He says, but whosoever carries the outworks of the citadel of oppression, the working class alone can raise it to the ground. And I think that's crucially important because he says, yes, absolutely, there are different forms of oppression, and it isn't, it isn't sort of a distraction to talk about women's liberation or black liberation or whatever the case may be. These are crucially important, but they only get to the sort of outposts of the citadel of oppression, and it's only the working class as a whole that can raise that citadel. And that's a crucially important point because, again, it's not about class force, it's not about a dismissal of these struggles, it's about saying these are really important, these are part of our class struggle, but in order to actually finish this, and that goes back to how we treated nationalism. You go, okay, you want freedom from the British, great, but that means nothing if they have 101 strings that control you economically, so how are you going to break that? And so it's that sort of totality, which again is rooted in his reading of Marx and Marxism and an understanding of the different vectors of oppression and how they're all part of this broader struggle for the working class. So I think if that answered the question, how we grasped, how we understood feminism, how we related to it, how we always treated women in the utmost as equals in the struggle, and how that was reflected in his politics and in what he said publicly as well.
Yeah, I mean, this text in particular, for folks, it's already up online. I'll make sure that everyone can find it. Socialism Made Easy. It's an easy Google search as well. It's really rich, and I'm trying to. I want to give people a little bit of the flavor, because one of the things that's really great about Connolly too is that not only is he making these critical theoretical points that, and I'd like, especially in the last section, to focus on like how it's extremely applicable today. He does it in a very accessible way.
Yeah.
And he makes this great point, for example, which especially in the United States is very apt, about how socialism is always treated as like a foreign force. And he makes this great distinction, though, between like capitalist and socialist internationalism that I'll read here. And it's very funny. It's very witty. He said, we socialists are always talking about the international solidarity of labor, about the oneness of our interests all over the world, and ever and anon working off our heaving chest operation on the bonds of fraternal sympathy, which should unite the wage slaves of the capitalist system. But there is another kind of bond, Russian railway bonds, which join not the workers, but the idlers of the world in fraternal sympathy, and which creates among the members of the capitalist class a feeling of identity, of interest, of international solidarity, which they don't perorate about, but which is most potent and effective notwithstanding.
Yeah.
And this puts it so plainly and well to folks that, it's one of those things, like, you might not be particularly interested in international affairs, but if you are interested in dealing with the forces that are holding you down, you must understand that they're an international system, because our opponents certainly do. And they don't need the beautiful poems about internationalism or the songs or anything like that. They need the money. And that is what is truly international about the capitalist class.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think the thing about that is Connolly was writing this in 1908, and we often, especially with technology and everything else, we're all very quick to succumb to the idea of novelty, and that our experience of what's going on now is completely new. And so all this talk about globalization, but there definitely were qualitative shifts brought about by information technology and new forms of transportation. So definitely were qualitative shifts in terms of the interconnection of global capital. But capital has always been international from the very start. And again, this goes back to the sort of racialized nature of capitalism and how it was rooted in slavery and all those other things. So capitalism has always been international, and the capitalist class classes have always been internationalist also. They've always had a much sharper understanding of their class interest and their shared interest and their conflict as well. I think it was Warren Buffett who famously said a few years ago that there is a class war going on and it's my class that's fighting it. You know, I mean, my class is winning. And that is the case. And I loved in that same section, he makes the point, the sort of immediate material connections. He goes, well, the guy who's exploiting you in your factory, he has bonds in that railway in Russia, and he's exploiting the workers over there. And so this isn't some sort of, you know, mystical idea or sort of romantic notion of internationalism. This is saying you guys are literally fighting the same thing, and you need to link up those things. So the internationalism was central for Connolly. He has this line, I can't remember where it is exactly, but he says, I consider the working man of another country, the working man of another country a patriot in the same way in which I consider the capitalist of my own country an implacable enemy. You know, and he understood that. He goes, I'm not having this, I'm not being, and it's likewise, he said it's absolutely mistaken to blame the crimes of the British government at the feet of the British people. You know, he fought against that narrow, simplistic nationalism and stressed the importance of the internationalism. Socialism Made Easy is such a rich pamphlet, and the thing it is it was written in 1907, 1908, and anytime I meet someone who's new to politics or just think it's one of the first things I recommend, because even though some of it is of its time in terms of the language and the references that I use, the substance of it is so important. So at the start of it, he, when he discusses internationalism, and he says this is why the workers should cheer on every victory for workers in any country, whatever it is, that's a victory for us as well. But as you walk through the pamphlet, he deals a little bit women's rights as well in that same pamphlet, and also at the end he has such really important points there and elsewhere on parliamentarianism and electoralism and the relationship between this and trade union organizing and building broader working class power. And these are ideas which are so relevant today. It's one of the things on a personal level has been a frustration in Britain the last few years, how much of this has been unlearned by people, even during the Corbyn moment and so forth. The understanding of the state wasn't there. The understanding of electoralism as important but secondary. The understanding of the need to center working class self-activity and root movements in the working class. That's completely been lost. And again, it's been lost for good historic objective reasons. We've had our ass kicked as a class for the last 80 years, so that's the last 50 years certainly.
And I actually wanted to jump forward to get into that, because that's sort of meatier theoretically right now. I just wanted to note one quick line too. Like, people should definitely read this. It's a very easy read. His hilarious. Go ahead, Matt.
I texted David he would kill on Substack with the form of this, and also the relevance, the content of the arguments are insanely relevant. But I got a section too, David. Unless you go first.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking we could get to this section on labor unions and the political party, but also people remember, he's very funny. He made a great point about holidays. It's like, oh, you have a hard time as a worker figuring out to do on your one day of holiday. Think about how hard it is to be a boss and have to figure out what to do for a whole summer. It's very funny. And honestly it's the kind of rhetoric that we need. But Paul, I mean, one of the big reasons I want to talk about James Connolly and specifically speak with you is because of this question of labor that Connolly does such a great job at just getting to the root of. In the US right now, much like the UK, we're in this kind of post movement from however you want to categorize what Corbynism was or what Bernie was, some form of populism, who knows, right? But there was certainly a lack of structure to these political movements. The party structure was not what was driving these. These were collective, groups of people that were coming together, and it was really inspiring and important. But we're now sort of in this post period, and we're trying to figure out what to do. And there's all these questions like, is it time to build a new party, whatever? And we talk a lot about that on this show, and sort of trying to work through it and make people understand, these are bigger than just proclamations, right? You can't just proclaim a party. Socialists have been proclaiming parties since, socialism was invented. And anyways, Connolly does a really great job at saying, you have to understand, if you are a socialist, that the labor struggle and the political struggle have to be completely linked. There is no way to do this without it. And I want to just tee you off on this by reading in this short passage here where he's talking about Gompers in the United States, who for folks who aren't familiar, was one of the founding members of the AFL in this country. Early in his life, he was very interested, or at least sympathetic to socialism, but very quickly became very much an anti-socialist and a rabid anti-socialist. And there's a big reason why the labor movement was so reactionary against socialist organization. But But particularly too, one thing that Gompers did in the United States was promote craft unions. So instead of an industry-wide unions, you would unionize the janitors as a separate organization to the rest of the working class, which severely weakened, the American labor movement to be able to win the victories here. And this is a little bit of a longer segment, but it's important. So he's talking about Gompers and why he failed. And then he is also saying this is why socialists have also failed too. He said, he failed Gompers, as even the socialists would fail if they remained equally blind to the natural law of our evolution into class consciousness. That natural law leads us as individuals to unite in our craft, as crafts to unite in our industry, as industries in our class. And the finished expression of that evolution is, we believe, the appearance of our class upon the political battleground with all the economic power behind it to enforce its mandates. Until that day dawns, our political parties of the working class are but propagandist agencies, John the Baptist of the new redemption. But when that day dawns, our political party will be armed with all our might of our class, will be revolutionary in fact, as well as in thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's crucially important. And I think, it goes back to what we've lost over the last 50, 60, 70 years in terms of, I've had these conversations for the last couple of years in Britain around the Corbyn thing. And I joined Labour briefly to vote for Corbyn, but I wasn't an active Labour member, and I wouldn't be for a whole variety of reasons. But I've had these conversations with people from the very start. I was like, look, even if Corbyn were to get elected as MP, and even if he were to achieve 100% of what he wanted to achieve, which none of this was ever going to happen, but even if that were to happen, it would be about 5% of what we want and what we need as socialists and as communists and Marxists. This isn't the limit of our ambition.
Mm-hmm.
And Connolly understood this from the outset. I'm certain maybe it's not in that pamphlet, maybe it's in somewhere else, but he said it on 2 or 3 occasions where he says the fight for control of the political state isn't the battle, it's the echo of the battle. Now again, he's not dismissing electoralism here. He's saying that's important, he said, but there's no point in getting there. There's no point in turning up to a gunfight with a teaspoon. You know what I mean? There's no point in sort of rushing to the elections and winning state power and then suddenly finding that that's not where power really is. It's interesting, there was a Marxist who passed away a few years ago called István Mészáros, and he had this great expression. He said, capitalism is the extra parliamentary force par excellence, and our movement has to be adequate to that. You know what I mean? So the thing is that when you get into power, if you elected a progressive government, wherever it is, they'd soon find that having the legislative levers of the legislature isn't where the power really is. I mean, it's part of it, and it's not an unimportant part of it. And political contest can be important for helping to shape people's ideological views and helping to forge a sense of class alliance. But that's only if you have a strong enough independent working class line. If instead you're trying to graft an element of socialism onto the Democratic Party or the Labour Party, whatever it is, you'll invariably fail. And again, not because of your efforts weren't genuine and not because they weren't serious. You're going to fail because these organizations are entrenched. They're part of the state in different ways in both sort of countries. The Democratic Party is a part of the US state. The Labour Party is a part of the British state. It manages and controls, dissent and sort of anger on one level there. So this is one thing Connolly understood as well, the importance of building an independent working class organization. And that wasn't, as you said, declaring another party. He has some really important lines about how any party or organization that isn't rooted in the working class and isn't part of the working class is just a sect. It's just a small group sort of out on the margins. And again, that's not even meant in a dismissive way or in a sort of moralistic way. That's an objective assessment. Hal Draper actually said the same thing. Hal Draper has an excellent article on sectism, which is interesting because Hal was in a few sects in his own time, but his analysis is still right. These sects that are formed, we've got a small group of people who've got the correct analysis as far as they're concerned, but have no serious material or organic connection to the class. It means nothing. And this actually goes back to Connolly's accessibility. So with the political education project that we put together in Britain, but which actually we've got Bill Fletcher Jr., for example, on our last session, because we wanted to try and be accessible to people from as far away as possible. But the thing we said is that what's crucially important for us is that we engage with these ideas, these important ideas, in a way in which you could go and sit with a friend or a neighbor in a pub or a cafe, and within 10 minutes have them convinced of the need to abolish property without having to quote Marx, without having to do anything. You can just have that conversation. And again, we've all done the background reading. I've spent years in my sort of professional line of work and in politics, reading Marx and reading Engels and reading sort of Trotsky and Lenin and Gramsci and the whole tradition. That's all fine. That's all interesting. That's all valuable. But unless you make it what Marx would have called a material force, unless you make those ideas a material force, they're not worth much of anything. And this is actually one of the problems with the contemporary left, why so much of it is sort of interscene bullshit arguments on Twitter and so forth about who's got the correct reading of Marx or who's got, because it's divorced from actual struggles. It's not actually engaged and embedded in working class communities in the day-to-day struggles. And that isn't an anti-theoretical position, and that certainly wasn't Connolly's position. Connolly, as I said, was immersed in the tradition, immersed in the theory, understood it acutely. But on this question of electoralism and state power, he didn't dismiss it, but he had the correct, I would say, orientation towards it, which was that, yeah, this is important, but before we start, and again, it wasn't a sort of mechanical, cause and effect thing, but let's prioritize organizing independent working class power, and then when we're strong enough, we can step out there, as you said, we'll step out on the field and we'll be a serious threat and a serious force, rather than something that can be broken, as has happened with and I agree with what you said about the DSA. I think some really valuable stuff has happened there and is still going on there, but it was always hampered by the attempt to sort of graft something onto the Democratic Party that was just completely alien to it. But that's a separate discussion.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's like, well, the bigger point here is, and we've been using the term, I don't think he coined it, but, the difference between being class focused and class rooted politics, right? And the difference, like class focused politics are great. But I mean, as you were mentioning earlier, the reason that working class is so important to socialist thought, is one, because we care about them, we come from them, they're our neighbors and our family and our friends, and that it's a massively large class, but it is a class that actually within capitalism has the power to withhold its labor and shut the whole thing down. And the real point about not being class rooted is that we can make the rhetorical gestures to that in power, but without being, having that root, we can't follow through on our threats.
That is so. One of the short pieces I sent over to you as well, and it's literally like 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs. Connolly makes that point again, and Connolly wasn't, I don't think, wasn't sentimental and wasn't romantic. You know what I mean? I think he had that sort of, as Che Guevara said, that you can't be a socialist unless you're capable of immense love. Connolly had that for working class people, and again, having left school at 11 and having worked in all manner of shitty jobs and having lived amongst the poorest of Scotland, Ireland, and the US, he saw this sort of degradation of children, exploitation of women, the absolute sort of destruction of people's personalities and physically and so forth. So he was locked into that, but also he understood in the Marxist sense the role that the working class plays because of its objective position within the capitalist mode of production, and that basically this is why, and within the sort of materialist conception of history, this is why the working class is so important. But then he framed it in a different way. He said, well, the reason the working class will do it is because they've nothing to lose, and this is the simple reality of it. I mean, again, you can if you, and again, this is no moral judgment on sort of any individual person, because it's not really about individuals, but if you've come from a fairly well-to-do background, but you've discovered socialism or Marxism or leftism, whatever you call it, in university or in grad school, and you're really into it and you like the ideas and you like the debates and so forth, when push comes to shove, there's a real chance that you'll bottle it. You know what I mean? When push comes to shove, there's a real chance, and we saw it in the UK here on the Corbyn thing, when there was the attempt at undermining the campaign with anti-Semitism, and when there was the Brexit vote, the sort of very sincere but more middle-class activists wet the bed. You know what I mean? When the claims about anti-Semitism were thrown out, they didn't understand they were in a fight, and they went, oh, well, how can we make this look nice, and how can we sort of be acceptable to the editors of The Guardian and so forth? When Brexit happened, because they had no real connection to the working class, communities, they went, oh, that's just right-wing people. And I've seen it with the US left. I don't follow US politics all that closely, because it's hard enough staying on top of the crap here. But when in the US, I've seen it, there's sort of anger from left circles at red state voters and so forth, and well, you get what you deserve, and now you can only say that if you've no connection to it, because there's a whole set of complex reasons why people vote one way or the other. And if you as a left haven't offered people a genuine alternative, haven't connected with them and made them think we can do something different, what do you expect? This is what you're kind of going to get.
No, I mean, it's especially here in Texas, it's very frustrating to talk to folks when they get really moralistic about it. Especially, it would matter regardless of what the actual facts are about it. But the facts are that we're seeing massive, one, working class people aren't voting, right? And two, it's not just like the white bubbas, country boys. It's Black people and it's Hispanic folks in South Texas who are flipping for Trump. Not the majority of that group or anything like that, but we're seeing that bleeding away. And to not recognize this as a problem, and instead of moralize about it, you're making a huge tactical error. But again, the people who really are doing that aren't as you were saying,
No.
one-rooted or engaged in really kind of doing socialist politics.
No, exactly. I mean, again, this is a separate matter, and again, I have no answers to this at the minute. We're trying to do it with the political education project. I helped set up a group in Manchester a little over a year ago called the Beehive, which is a much smaller political education group, but it's run for a year now, where we've had working class activists, people who are not involved with any parties or whatever it is. We've had working class activists for the last year and a half, meeting more or less every 2 weeks, and we've covered everything from historical materialism to the media and ideology to Marxist economics, and so we're trying to do those things. But I can't see any easy or any quick answer to social media. On social media, it seems in large part that it's as if various shades of leftism, it's basically like a massive multiplayer online role-playing game. People have these identities that they lock into, and usually it's a sort of hammer and sickle. That person normally likes anime and stuff like that, and then someone else would be into something else, and it's like a personality that you have online. But there are people who, for a variety of reasons, aren't engaged in any serious politics outside of that. Or then if they do engage in it, they come up with the worst, most sort of tedious ultra-left stuff. We want to sort of smash this or smash that, which is no way of developing serious long-term politics. But that's a much bigger challenge for all of us. Again, my view and what we try and do with the political education project is just sort of do it one small stone at a time. It's a big job ahead of us, and I'd love if we could call a general strike tomorrow, but we're not in that position right now. So we try and build what we're going to call in our last session, we try and build the infrastructure of dissent. We try and create independent, confident, well clued up working class activists who are connected with each other, who've developed confidence and trust in each other, so that whatever movements or whatever struggles emerge over the coming years, you've got links there and connections with people, and you can have a better chance of it. But yeah, that's the long road, and there's no other option around it, unfortunately.
Yeah, you were lamenting earlier that a lot of this has been lost in terms of knowledge. There's this part I wanted to read about electoralism. He says, whether we believe, as I believe, that the electoral field offers it opportunities it would be criminal to ignore, or believe, as some do, that electoral action on the part of the economic organizations is at present premature, one thing we can be agreed upon, if we accept the outline of history I've just sketched, that it is necessary to remember that at the present stage of development, all actions of our class at the ballot box are in the nature of mere preliminary skirmishes or educational campaigns, and that the conquest of political power by the working class wants or waits upon the conquest of economic power. I mean, this a lot of debates that, and different types of navel gazing that was engaged upon the last 4 years. I mean, he just had the very common sense approach to it right there.
Yeah, a common sense approach, but also one, as I say, underpinned by the heavy theory.
Right.
He doesn't feel the need to pull out sort of Marxist critique of the program, but you can see the echoes there and you can see the overlap. So he's immersed in that tradition. He's immersed in the left wing of the Second International, but he doesn't want to get likes on Twitter. He doesn't want to get tenure in a university. He wants to convince the people that are going out to the factory tomorrow, or going out to the building site tomorrow, or going out to the hospital tomorrow. And that's how he wrote, and that's how he could do that in part. I don't buy into sort of variations on sort of so-called standpoint epistemology, and I don't think it's a case of saying, oh, unless you're working class you can't understand. I think it's more complex than that. But I mean, Brecht has a great poem, I can't remember the title of the poem, but it basically says, comrade, only slaves can free you, all of us are nothing, everything, all of us are none, or something. I can't remember the exact, but the basic point here is that and this is what Marx said in a different way, it's only those who are exploited by the system structurally and locked into it, they're the only ones who can possibly crack it. And so Connolly, because of his life experiences, married with his political education, married with his understanding of Marxism and the Marxist tradition, he's able to come and say this. Again, it's the highest form of, for me, it's the highest form of Marxism. If you can sit down with your friends who left school at 15 or 16 and in the space of 10-15 minutes convince them of the need for us to engage in fundamental social transformation, that's worth more than 50 degrees or 60 degrees or anything else like that. And again, in terms of it being lost, I'd be sort of remiss if I didn't say that there are good reasons we've lost it. As a class on a global level, and particularly in Western Europe and North America, we've been defeated roundly, more or less, over the last 40 years in particular. When they broke the air traffic control in New York, when they broke the miners here in Britain, when they broke the public sector workers in France, when they overthrew Pinochet in Chile, when they sustained for as long as they could apartheid South Africa, when they supported Suharto in Indonesia, right across the globe in so many ways, the US imperialism and the British and the French and so forth, and also internally, working class movements were beaten. And that's an important point, because again, it's okay to lose. It's not nice, but it's okay to lose. What's not okay is not to learn from it. And that's unfortunately kind of what's happened in a very large collective way. And again, people have written about this. Perry Anderson has a good book on sort of Western Marxism, and it's ironic because it's Perry Anderson, but he does make a very valid point about how, following the defeat of the German Revolution, there's sort of a bifurcation where on the one hand, Marxism becomes a dogma in the East around Stalin and around sort of Diamat and an official understanding of Marxism. But in the West, it retreats into academia, and it becomes more about questions of culture and questions of sort of the different ways in which the system reproduces itself, rather than class struggle and engage sort of thinking through how to build organization, how to confront state power. And that then leads on to Western communism and the complete collapse and capitulation of historical social democracy. So again, this isn't me. I don't believe in being moralistic about what people do. I think moralism is an absolute poison to politics. But it is a reality that we're in this position. And again, lots of people now are engaged in these debates. And unfortunately, I suspect it's going to happen in the US, or has happened in the US. It's happened over here as well. With the collapse of Corbynism and the sort of defeat of that moment, there's now a sort of fetishization of direct action and trade unionism. So just do that, you know, screw electoralism, screw politics, let's just do this. And that's the other end of the same problem. Because again, and as I say, Connolly dealt with it there in a couple of paragraphs. He said, yeah, look, both of these things are connected. We have to engage in both as much as we can. We can understand that there's an order of priority, that building independent working class power on the industrial field takes priority, but we still have to engage in the elections. He also, when he stood for election in Glasgow, was it Glasgow? I can't remember. He stood for election in Scotland before he moved to Ireland. He gave a speech where he says, I see my role, if I'm elected, to be a disruptor on behalf of my class. I'll get in there and I'll cause them much trouble. I won't try and sort of, you know, gain traction and be seen as a, he has this great line, Connolly, he says, don't be practical in politics. If you're practical in politics, that means you've schooled yourself to behave in the way that those who rob you want you to behave. So his thing wouldn't be about being respectable and trying to organize electoral politics around that and getting an op-ed in the New York Times or the Guardian, or whatever it is. His thing would be, we'd engage in electoral politics, but we'll show how much bullshit this is. We'll show how rigged this whole system is, and we keep building the industrial base and keep building the community organizations and get ready to engage in sort of illegal activity if need be, because that's what we know is important. That's been completely lost. And again, when people do, whether it's the Democrats, whether it's the Labour Party, when people get involved in that with the best will in the world, they fail to grasp, I think, often the nature of state power, the nature of the organizations they're involved with, the gravitational force that they have. And again, I don't know the internal workings of the Democratic Party, but in Britain, people in the Labour Party, good people on the left, they spend most of their time fighting internal elections or gearing up to support the party in an external election. And even though they know abstractly that trade union work and community organization is what's key, they can't do it. They just don't do it. Even though they know they should do it, they're locked into the other stuff because that's what takes up your time. So I suppose what Connolly offers us is advice and a way of thinking that is about reorientating our focus and reorientating how we think about these things. And I think he remains, that's one of the reasons why I think he remains really valuable.
Yeah, and I think, he's somebody who's very, very critical, and we really are at a moment right now where we have opportunities to try to reset the ship.
Yeah.
Paul, I would love to just do this all day. I think we're just going to have to do it again sometime very soon.
Yeah, we never even got to all the parts I wrote LOL next to.
We definitely should do a part 2 of Connolly, because he's a rich enough thinker, and the questions that he brings up are so brilliant. But Paul, we'll put all the links and stuff so people can find your work on this post. So check that out, all of y'all, and we'll look forward to doing this again in the future sometime soon.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, guys. Take care.
Thanks, Walt.